Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And let's get started. So good afternoon and aloha. O pepeluali kamahi no olelo Hawaii no laila. Belina mai kako. Onik Los Banos ko uinoa. Oihana vau meka Alzheimer's Association Aloha Chapter. O vau ke Hawaii Island Regional Coordinator. No hilo ka aina ua kanilehua mayo. Mahalo no kako hui pu ana me mako no kia papahana. So February is Hawaiian Language Month, so therefore, Velina mai kako, or greetings, everyone. I'm Los Banos. I work with the Alzheimer's Association Aloha Chapter. I'm the Hawaii Island Regional Coordinator here in Hilo, and I want to thank you all for joining us for today's program. So we are in webinar mode, and so of course, during today's program, you are on mute, but we do want to encourage your questions using the Q&A function here on Zoom. I also want to let you know that you can definitely engage with each other and us via chat, so you can go ahead and say hello in there if you want right now. We will have some time at the end of today's program to go through some of your questions. Also, today's program is going to be recorded. Before we start today's program, I'd like to share a mele with you. This is a very simple song that was written by Auntie Luika Pereira. She was actually the student government president at the University of Hawaii at Hilo when I was doing my undergrad there. She actually retired from the Department of Education and then came back to the University of Hawaii at Hilo to get her bachelor's degree in the spring of 2002. So she was a very non-traditional student, very much older than all of us, and a wonderful native Hawaiian lady. Many of us considered her like kupuna, and we looked up to her. So she wrote this mele for us as student leaders at the time, and we would sing it at events on campus, or we would sing it whenever we were traveling at a conference, or even if we went to visit our legislators at the Capitol. We basically had this song as a gift that we would present to anyone we met. As you know, or may know, songs and chants are a very important part of Hawaiian culture because they're important vehicles for us to capture our history and our memories. In August 2002, just a few months after Auntie Luika graduated, she actually passed away. So there are only a handful of us left that know this mele. I know many of us are here today because of our connection with Alzheimer's disease and other dementia. And in my work, I've heard from families a few times that it goes something like, my loved one has dementia and they remember nothing. But that's okay because we're going to remember for them. I'm pretty sure Auntie Luika didn't have dementia at the end of her life, but I do want to share her song with you to encourage you to remember others and also to remember for others when they no longer can. I offer this song as a ray of light to our association, to our researchers, our trial participants, our supporters, and everyone in the community who has been touched by Alzheimer's and other dementia. Together we're placing these stepping stones that will get us to that cure, and hopefully that one day, the first survivor. While I share this mele with you, I want you to think of people who have placed stepping stones before you to help you get where you are today. I also want you to think about who you're placing stepping stones down for as well. This mele is titled Mele Aloha. Aloha e, aloha e, aloha e. Aloha no na kupuna no keia aina. Eia no mako. Na pua o Hawaii nei. Na ya mako. He keiki wale no. Mahalo no. Mahalo no. Mahalo no. Uapau uano. Mahalo for allowing me to share that mele with you. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our executive director here at the Alzheimer's Association Aloha Chapter, LJ Duenas. Good afternoon and aloha, LJ.
Aloha, everyone, and welcome to the era of treatment. We are excited to be able to share with you recent updates in dementia science that is getting us closer to realizing our vision of a world without Alzheimer's and all other dementia. And while researchers work tirelessly on the science, we remain committed to supporting those living with the disease, their families, and caregivers. Caregivers just like Chef Lee Anderson of Maui, who was a caregiver for her mom, who recently passed due to Alzheimer's disease. Chef Lee is the owner and executive chef of Sugar Beach Events on Maui, which is an internationally recognized oceanfront catering venue. As a caregiver for her mom, Chef Lee frequently flew back and forth between Maui and the US mainland. So let's hear her story.
Hi, my name's Lee Anderson. I'm the chef and owner at Sugar Beach Events on Maui. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about my mom, Judy McBride. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's about 9 years ago. She was a wonderful educator. She was a band director and in the music industry for 40 years. She was an adventurous woman. She whitewater rafted. She raced cars. She was a snow skier. She was just a dynamic woman, and everybody who ever met her loved her. She was just that person. She had a snow skiing accident. She was skiing Black Diamond Hills in Colorado 10 years ago when she was 75 and had a TBI because of that. She fell and hit her head, cracked her helmet, and had a brain bleed, so had to have a minor brain surgery. And that's what really kind of started the dementia Alzheimer's process for her. We knew on some level she would probably get it because her mom and her brother both suffer from dementia. So we were expecting it, but we weren't ready for it. I lived on Maui for 17 years, and 3 years ago we decided it was time to move my mom to a secure facility. She wandered one day, and my father didn't know if he was going to have a heart attack trying to find her. And so we moved her to a really great facility, and it really allowed all of us to take a breath. People talk about all the time that they would never put their loved one in a facility because it's your responsibility to care for them. Luckily, my parents had planned for their future. They had long-term care, health insurance, and they really were smart about how they handled things. My dad had become her caregiver, and for really 2 long years, midway in the process, because he was caring for her, the love that was always there, they were married 66 years, the love kind of took a back seat because his responsibility was her safety and her well-being. And I missed seeing that in their relationship, their love, their husband and wife relationship. When we got mom into a really great place here in Charleston, South Carolina, that relationship was really restored. And seeing that made me so happy. My dad was just able to be the husband again. He didn't have to worry about all the day-to-day details. We had a great team at the facility to help out with that. So that's one thing I always tell people when they get scared about a loved one being able to take care of them at home or what. I witnessed firsthand the joy that can come back if you're able to get your loved one in a memory care facility. I moved back to Charleston a year ago in order to help care for my mom because my dad's 85 and it was getting hard for him too. It was bittersweet, but I would not change any moment for anything in the world because I got to spend the last year of my mom's life with her. My mom passed away 3 weeks ago, and it's been tough. They do say that you lose your loved one twice. You do. My mom forgot who I was almost a year ago, shortly after I came back. Every once in a while, you'd see that she had that gleam in her eye when I would walk in and go visit her. I tried to see her every day. And then when she passed 3 weeks ago, you think you're prepared for it and you want peace for them, but boy, it just rips your heart out. But we're making it through as a family. We're really supporting each other through this process, my brother and his family and my dad and I. And upon my mom's death, we decided as a family to give the ultimate gift, and we donated her brain to the Carol Campbell Alzheimer's Research Facility for Neurology at MUSC in Charleston, South Carolina. My mom was an educator her entire life. What better way for us to honor her than to allow her brain to continue to educate over the next 10 years. They're going to use her brain for 10 years, up to 10 years, to continue the fight against Alzheimer's. It doesn't get more special than that. And we are so grateful as a family that we were able to do that. We are not giving up on this fight. We are finding a cure. It will happen. My mom, Judy McBride, her death will not have been in vain. All the suffering we have all been through will not be in vain. Do not give up. We are not going to lose this battle. Thank you for giving me some time to share about my mom and what an amazing woman she was. And I will continue to fight for Alzheimer's because I believe in what we are doing and how we will get there. Don't give up.
Okay, well, mahalo Lee for sharing your story. What a powerful story that was. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Rebecca Edelmayer. Dr. Edelmayer has over 20 years of experience as a practicing scientist and educator. She spent more than 6 years as a pharmacologist in the neuroscience and immunology discovery divisions at Abbott and AbbVie, where she was recognized as an emerging scientific leader. She completed her PhD and postdoctoral training in medical pharmacology with a focus on neuropharmacology at the University of Arizona College of Medicine. Dr. Edelmayer holds a bachelor's degree in neuroscience from the University of Pittsburgh, where she also completed a National Institute of Mental Health Research Fellowship. Dr. Edelmayer is a senior director, scientific engagement for the Alzheimer's Association, where she manages initiatives designed to unite researchers and clinicians with leaders of industry, regulatory agencies, and the government on topics related to biomarker testing, new investigational treatments, and use of digital health and biotech approaches for studying cognition. So, Dr. Edelmayer, aloha and welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Aloha, Nick. Thank you so much for the introduction. And it really is a pleasure to be with you all today. There is so much to talk with you about in terms of the progress that's being made in research. And I think it's a really exciting time. My hope today was to be able to walk through a lot of this progress, really a whirlwind tour of what's going on in the field, what you can take home with you in terms of hopefully a better understanding of how progress is being made, and leave with hope that research really is going to lead us to more advancements in treatment and care. Many of you are very familiar with our organization, but for those who are not, we are here and we are dedicated to supporting Alzheimer's care, support for individuals and their families. And I'm here today to talk to you about that research aspect of our organization. Our work really is about people in science. And everything that we do is sort of incubated in science to help us come forward with more evidence for how we drive risk reduction, how we help with early detection and diagnosis, and how we continue to maximize quality and care and support. All of that driven through a number of the efforts that the Alzheimer's Association is leading. And just to give you a few examples today, our team here as part of the medical and scientific division of our organization is helping through a number of different aspects to continue to advance science across the globe. We have many partnerships. We're conducting intramural research. We're convening and connecting researchers across the globe. We continue to develop standards and guidelines for care and research. And our goal is also continue to fund research across the world. We have a very important research strategy. The hope is that we are always seeding, speeding, and scaling these new ideas. And through many of the Alzheimer's Association's efforts, particularly through research and policy, we hope to make sure that we're accelerating the science as fast as possible. And it really is so exciting to see that we are the largest nonprofit funder of Alzheimer's and dementia research in the world. I can tell you today that we currently have over $300 million active in over 950 projects in 48 countries across the planet. And one thing that's really exciting to note is these numbers are actually probably going to change tomorrow. We have new grants going out to researchers around the world. So it's just so exciting to see that all of our hard work continues to pay off in terms of building our knowledge about Alzheimer's disease and other dementia, and how we can continue to discover new treatments and care opportunities. We're not just funding through our organization, but one of the things that the association continues to do is that we are relentless advocates of continuing to raise federal dollars that are devoted to Alzheimer's and dementia research. So much of our advocacy efforts are really important in creating sort of the appropriations that our federal government gives out, particularly to Alzheimer's and related dementia research funding at the National Institute of Health. And you can see just based on this graph, just since 2016, we've nearly quadrupled the funding that's coming out of the NIH to researchers across the United States. I should actually say it's gone more than sevenfold. We're up to over $3.7 billion in 2023, which is just really exciting to see, because this is a way that we can continue to fund new advances in research that maybe are less conservative, even more risky, and newer ideas that and really helping to fund new generations of scientists moving forward. One of the things the association is incredibly active in is how do we bring researchers and clinicians together to make sure that they are discussing their discoveries and discussing results from new research and science that they're conducting across the globe. And we have year-round opportunities for researchers and clinicians to take part in conferences and meetings that may be dedicated to specific topics. Maybe these are burgeoning areas of research or clinical practice. Maybe they're located in specific locations. Like you can see here that we're having a satellite symposium hosted in Mexico City coming up in May. Or they may be for specific career stages. Our goal is to continue to support the next generation of clinicians and researchers. And we have our Alzheimer's Association International Conference, Neuroscience Next Conference, that's coming up in April. But one of our big conferences that's coming up that we're really gearing up for is our Alzheimer's Association International Conference. We host this every year. Last year it was hosted in San Diego, and this year it will be hosted in Amsterdam, Netherlands. And we have a record-breaking number of abstracts that have been submitted for AAIC already this year. I can tell you I have 5,000 abstracts, over 5,000, that I have to read before March 1st. So I have a lot of work to still do to really understand a lot of the science that's going to be presented at our conference. And it's just so exciting to see that scientists continue to want to be a part of AAIC. And this is really the largest global dementia conference on dementia science, bringing these professionals and researchers together that happens every year around the world. So it's really exciting to see that these continue to be places of interest for and participation for people. We really hope to see a lot of new discoveries presented at AAIC, and it's an important time for us to continue to follow this exciting time in research. One of the things I want to touch base with everyone on this call is to level set a little bit about a couple, I think, very important topics that I want to cover before we dive into some of the advances that we're seeing, just to make sure that we're all on the same page around certain vocabulary and sort of knowledge that's been developed based on the research. Well, I think one of the biggest questions that I get when I'm traveling around the country is, what is the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease? And sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, but Alzheimer's really is the disease that causes the symptoms, which are really, that's the term dementia that we use. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause. It's defined by different biological changes that have happened in the brain. Dementia is sort of the experience or the symptoms. So they can include things like cognitive changes in someone's memory or thinking, even changes in their behavior, or even psychological symptoms related to agitation, aggression, depression, anxiety. And so dementia can be a sort of this collection of symptoms that are experienced by a number of different diseases that can cause them. Vascular disease can also cause symptoms of dementia. Lewy body diseases, frontotemporal degeneration is another type. What we're seeing based on the research, though, is that many people are living with something called mixed dementia, meaning they have multiple diseases that may be defining the underlying biology that's causing those symptoms of dementia, and something that we're continuing to study. One thing that I did want to also touch on here is really, because Alzheimer's is the most common cause of dementia, what really defines Alzheimer's biologically? And what we understand today is that there are hallmark changes that are occurring in the brain. There's changes in a protein known as beta amyloid in the brain. This protein builds up in what they call sticky plaques around the outside of many of the neurons in our brains. And then there's something called tau tangles, or the protein called tau builds up inside of those neurons in our brain. And both of these changes, the beta amyloid plaques and the tau tangles, we know they contribute to sort of a decrease in the overall cell health in our brains, in areas of our brain that are really important for our memories, our thinking. You actually see the shrinkage of brain tissue in those areas of the brain. But there's many other aspects of biological change that are also occurring in the brain. But to have Alzheimer's disease, you have to have beta amyloid plaques, tau tangles, and neurodegeneration to be diagnosed with this disease. But we know there's neuroinflammation, changes in the blood vessels, changes in your immune system. Many of these are complex components of Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is also a continuum, and I want to make sure we define a couple topics related to that continuum. We know that Alzheimer's disease takes time to progress in each individual, and this amount of time that it takes to progress from stage to stage can be different across each person, and their symptoms may be different across each person. The asymptomatic, or the sometimes you may hear this called the preclinical stage. This is a stage of Alzheimer's disease where there's no cognitive symptoms yet, no changes in their memory or thinking, but there's possibly some of those biological changes already occurring in the brain, like the amyloid plaques or the tau tangles. Mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, due to Alzheimer's disease is another stage. This is a stage of, I would say, early cognitive ability loss, where someone may still have the ability to do most activities of daily living and they're not interrupted. But mild cognitive impairment really is a stage before someone progresses into dementia. Not everyone goes on to develop dementia from mild cognitive impairment, but most people will pass through this stage of MCI. Now, dementia due to Alzheimer's disease means they're living with those biological changes in their brain, but then they're starting to progress over time into symptoms that become more and more interfering with their daily activities of living, from mild to moderate to severe, until someone has most of their daily activities interfered with. Now, one thing to be important to note, you'll notice later as I'll bring this graph up, is that there's treatments that are being developed for all different stages of this Alzheimer's disease continuum. There are treatments in development for the mild, moderate, and severe stages. There are treatments that have been developed for the mild cognitive impairment and mild stages. And there's even treatments that are being tested in the asymptomatic or preclinical stages of Alzheimer's disease. So what may impact risk for cognitive decline or dementia? Now, that's something that's being studied across the globe right now, and it's a huge topic of interest when we get to our many of our conferences and also at our Alzheimer's Association International Conference. When we think about what may drive risk in each individual, we're learning more and more every day. We know for Alzheimer's disease, age is the biggest risk factor, but we know that genetics, race and ethnicity, your sex and gender also play a role. These are things that you cannot necessarily change. They are non-modifiable. But modifiable risk factors, those are things that we may be able to change, and they may also drive some of our overall risk. When we're talking about modifiable factors, we're talking about our physical activity, our cardiovascular health, our sleep, our diet, our environmental lifestyle factors, even traumatic brain injury. We know that there's a constellation of reasons that may be both fundamental and unique to each individual that's driving their risk for disease. We also know that things like social determinants of health, access to quality health care, access to education, access to safe environments to exercise in, a lot of these may drive some of these factors. And we're continuing to learn about how each one may drive risk in each individual, each group, and each population. And the strength of our understanding is different across these risk factors. But one thing that we are learning is that much of the research boils down to the fact that what's going to be good for your heart is going to be good for your brain. Things that help to support our cardiovascular health over time, even physical activity, our nutrition, those types of things support our cardiovascular health. Those are really, really important for our brain. So if you can take one thing home today about what we're learning about risk is that, well, I guess two things. One is that what's good for your heart is good for your brain, but there's still a lot more research that we need to do to truly develop what that perfect recipe for success is for each individual in terms of what they should be doing to drive down their risk. But the research will show us the way. I want to now touch on early detection and diagnosis and why it's so important and why we're focused on this from a research perspective. We know that early diagnosis can have both emotional, social, and medical benefits. It helps people understand their symptoms. It helps people explore treatment options. How do they even potentially prevent complications or prevent other health conditions? It helps you to make decisions when you can also be a part of that decision-making process. And even potentially participating in clinical trials that might be a right fit for you, where you may be able to benefit from new discoveries that are being tested today. And so when we think about how early detection and diagnosis are so important, doctors and patients need different types of tools and tests that are going to help support that process, make it easier to detect the disease earlier, and then also aid in that diagnosis. And we've seen a lot of advances taking place in something called biomarkers. Biomarkers, you're all very familiar with these. These are tools that are used every day to help with other disease areas and for Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. You can imagine something like cholesterol. We use that test to learn about our risk for heart disease, right? You go to your doctor, you get a blood test. They look at all of the different types of cholesterols in your blood to help paint a picture of what your overall health or risk for heart disease looks like. We need that same thing for Alzheimer's disease. We need tools like brain imaging. We need things like blood tests. We are also seeing a lot of emerging research being done in other types of tests like retinal imaging. Wouldn't that be so cool if you could look into our eyes and use that as a tool to understand what might be happening in our brains? And certainly things like our DNA and understanding how that may fit into sort of the broader scope around risk and what it can tell us about what treatments might be most effective in our bodies. All of that is being studied today. And we're seeing a lot of advances in brain imaging. You've probably heard of amyloid PET imaging and tau PET imaging. And amyloid and tau PET imaging can actually pick up those amyloid plaques and tau tangles in the brain, and they're being used in clinical trials today. There's still a lot of barriers to access to these types of imaging technologies. Amyloid PET imaging is still not covered by insurance, but there are large clinical studies ongoing today like the IDEAS study and the new IDEAS study, where patients who are participating in these studies may have access to PET imaging to learn whether or not those amyloid PET images will change their clinical care. There's a lot more work that still needs to be done related to imaging. Cerebral spinal fluid analysis is another place we're seeing a lot of advances. If any of you have been following regulatory approvals like I have, you may have seen over the past year, about a year ago, there was the first FDA-approved amyloid CSF test on the market. So you get your cerebral spinal fluid through a lumbar puncture, and they're able to extract some of that clear fluid from your spinal cord area. And that's that beautiful fluid that bathes your spinal cord and brain. And actually testing some of the substances inside there can tell us a lot about what might be happening in our brains. And this first FDA-approved amyloid CSF test tells us about the presence of amyloid in our cerebral spinal fluid and the likelihood that we have amyloid plaques in our brain. And these types of tests are going to be really important for helping in diagnosis and also confirming whether you may be a right fit for a particular new therapeutic. There's a lot of new emerging tests that are being developed today to not only look for the presence of certain molecules in the cerebral spinal fluid related to Alzheimer's disease, but even other types of molecules like alpha-synuclein could be used to detect whether or not you may have some of the key changes associated with Parkinson's disease or in dementia with Lewy body diseases. So there's all different types of tests that are in development today related to cerebral spinal fluid. But what we really need are blood tests. We know those are going to be the easiest for patients and even for doctors. There's a lot of work that's been going on in measuring beta amyloid and tau in the blood, but also some of those emerging tests to look at alpha-synuclein, even markers of cell death in the brain, or inflammation, or even vascular related changes. The Alzheimer's Association worked with experts around the globe just last year to publish what we call appropriate use recommendations for blood tests. Because these are making such great progress, we know that they will be eventually being used in the clinic, I think more broadly, on a regular basis. But right now, we're seeing that these blood tests really are demonstrating themselves to be a very, very valuable tool in helping to be used in clinical trials, not only to enroll participants, but also to show changes that might be happening in the body associated with a particular treatment that's being tested. There are 3 types of blood tests that can predict the presence of amyloid brain plaques that have hit the commercial market. None of them are approved by the FDA yet. They must be prescribed by healthcare providers to individuals that have a cognitive concern. While these blood tests are not yet really ready for broad use in the clinic, we do think that these tests are really making remarkable progress. And we hope in the next few years, you're really going to be seeing these tests used more regularly. What we're trying to see really are changes in how we modernize the diagnosis for Alzheimer's disease. These and other dementias, these diseases are diseases of biology. We have to be able to understand those changes, those biological underpinnings that might be changing in the brain before anyone experiences symptoms. And for the vast majority of, I think, up until now, we've been mostly diagnosing people based on their medical history and changes in their cognition, but that means we're capturing them at an advanced stage of that Alzheimer's disease continuum when they are at advanced age, but they're also experiencing potentially already moderate to severe symptoms. Our goal is to change this paradigm where people are having biomarker testing conducted earlier on to help with that early diagnosis and shift that diagnosis to that preclinical phase, where then we would be able to know whether or not they have those hallmark changes in the brain before they get symptoms. And it really gives us a window then to treat as early as possible. And what we've learned from all of this research is telling us that probably 10 to 20 years before anyone is experiencing symptoms, they have those brain changes occurring in their brains already. And so this gives us a possibility of actually doing what we would even call prevention trials, which is really exciting to see. And you can think about this like how we treat other diseases today. You would not want to try to diagnose someone in stage 4 cancer. You want to capture them at the earliest stage, like stage 1. So now for cancer field, We're in a place where we're doing prevention, right? You're getting screenings over time. We're moving in that direction for Alzheimer's as well. So why is it so important that to think about early detection? And I think a point that needs to be made today is that it's so important that we're detecting Alzheimer's disease early because you need to also understand the treatment landscape. What are the new treatments designed to do, and who are they the best fit for based on the clinical trial data that we've seen today? So I want to walk through where some of those treatments are. We have now 7 FDA-approved therapies for Alzheimer's disease. The first 5 that you see in this slide are ones that are really aimed at treating the cognitive symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. The donepezil, the memantine, these drugs really go after sort of, I would say, improving the communication between the cells. The way I'd like to describe these drugs is that, sometimes as the disease process moves forward, what happens is the cells become less able to talk to each other efficiently and effectively. And so what these drugs try to do is they try to increase that communication. I kind of describe this as, it teaches one cell to talk a little bit louder and another cell to listen a little bit better to the other cell. But what these drugs do not do is they do not prevent the cells in the brain from dying. So in the end, when some cells start dying, it doesn't matter how loud one cell is talking and how well another cell can listen, they can't communicate anymore. They can't hear each other. That's because we need drugs that are going to be designed and treatments that are going to be designed to prevent those cells from dying in the first place, to prevent them from becoming sick. These 2 new drugs on the right side of your screen are treatments that go after the amyloid plaques in the brain, aducanumab or Aduhelm, and lecanemab or Leqembi. Those are their names. Now, these 2 drugs really go after that underlying disease process, and they're the first drugs to be approved that go after the disease process that also are meant to slow down the progression of the disease. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about these drugs and why and how they're designed. And when we're talking about this amyloid beta in the brain, this is a bit of a cartoon representation of how we understand amyloid beta to exist in our brains. It exists in many shapes and forms, and there really is a dynamic process in terms of how these shapes and forms sort of transition into each other. It's not linear. So you can see that many of these little, what they call monomers, little pieces, sometimes they may stack up on each other and become something called protofibrils and then maybe fibrils, but they could also turn into something called oligomers, which are these little clumped up bits of beta amyloid. And then also there's plaques. The plaques are some of the things that we can see with the beta amyloid imaging. And our goal is then to go after this process. We're not entirely sure which of these particular forms of beta amyloid are the most toxic to our brains. So that's why there's a number of different treatments that are in development today that go after different aspects. And I'll show you right here. When we look at some of the monoclonal antibody treatments that are being developed today, these are treatments that are targeting beta amyloid. They go after different places of the amyloid, different types of that amyloid process, as I noted. So aducanumab that was just approved goes after primarily the amyloid plaques, but it can also go after other aggregated forms of amyloid beta. Lecanemab primarily goes after something called the protofibrils, but it can also go after fibrils and oligomers. Drugs like donanemab would only really go after the plaques. Another one called solanezumab only really goes after the monomers. So I show you all of this so that you can get an idea of not only why is it important that we continue to think about targeting different aspects of beta amyloid plaque formation, but also you could compare this to other areas of treatment development today. You can think back on when there were the first approvals of new hypertension or blood pressure medicines. They maybe started out with 1 or 2, but there's probably dozens of blood pressure medications that are available today, some within the same class, like these drugs, where they kind of target the same process. And there's other drugs that go after different aspects of treating blood pressure. But we need that same type of approach for Alzheimer's as well. Many different approaches that are potentially going to be a better fit for each individual. And so one of the things that I did want to note to you was that we're really in this new phase of treatment now. We've had approval of 2 new medications, and I bring up this graphic so that you can kind of understand the timeline that we're following. Typically, all of these clinical trials have to make it through phase 3 clinical trial results before they're receiving approvals. Aducanumab and lecanemab used their phase 2 data to receive accelerated approval, which is a process that's allowing for drugs and treatments to be approved, particularly for diseases that are severe and fatal with unmet medical need. And those 2 drugs will also move through what they call the traditional approval process. We hope to see more information about lecanemab's traditional approval in July of 2023. So that's coming up rapidly. But donanemab and solanezumab, we're following those 2 drugs that go after the beta amyloid as well. And we anticipate seeing some of their phase 3 clinical trial results just in the next few weeks to months. And hopefully we'll see them submit applications to the FDA for their review later on in the next year or so. So we're following these all very closely because these are the treatments that are at the latest stage in the clinical trial pipeline. But there's a lot more in the pipeline today. I do want to note, again, the 2 that were FDA approved. Again, let's talk a little bit more about really what these drugs are designed to do. Here's a little bit more related to the prescribing information for these treatments. As I noted earlier, I'd be coming back to that graphic. These 2 treatments are approved for individuals that have mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease or mild Alzheimer's dementia. So you can say that this drug is really for individuals that are in the early stage of Alzheimer's disease. They also need to have evidence of buildup of those amyloid plaques in the brain. And that's why I've spent so much time talking to you about the importance of biomarker testing and the need to have those tests to be able to look at the presence of beta amyloid in the brain, whether it's cerebral spinal fluid analysis or through PET imaging, because you wouldn't want to give someone a treatment if they don't actually have Alzheimer's disease and they don't have that biological change in the brain that the drug is designed to go after. So that is the same for both of these 2 drugs, that mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease, and mild Alzheimer's dementia, and they also have to have confirmation of amyloid. For these drugs, they also will have side effects, as do any drugs. And a few of those common side effects are listed here: headache, fall, infusion-related reactions. That would come because these drugs are actually taken through an infusion into the blood vessel. And so people can maybe have an allergic reaction associated with that injection. One of the other side effects that you may not be as familiar with is our amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what that is so that you become more familiar. Amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, we call it ARIA for short because it's a little bit of a tongue twister. ARIA really is a common, but it's a manageable side effect that does not usually cause any symptoms, but it can be serious. And how we describe ARIA is that it can sort of appear in 2 forms. ARIA-E is typically a temporary swelling in areas of the brain that usually resolves over time. ARIA-E stands for edema, or really that swelling. ARIA-H stands for small spots of bleeding in or on the surface of the brain, or as microhemorrhages. That's the H. Now, ARIA is something that is a little bit newer of a side effect that many, even clinicians and patients, are not experienced with, but it is something that has been around for some time. And the Alzheimer's Association has only not been aware of this for some time, but it actually, we've helped to define what ARIA is. We've worked with international experts around the world to not only create recommendations for identifying ARIA, but also mitigating the risk for ARIA and managing the side effect in clinical trials. And I have to tell you a bit of a fun fact is that ARIA was really coined, and this task force was developed based on our Alzheimer's Association International Conference that was hosted in Hawaii back in 2010. And that's when the discussion started about ARIA and what does it mean? How do we understand it? How can we make sure that clinical trials can continue to advance forward that are using these drugs that go after the amyloid in the brain. So we as an organization are very familiar with this concept, but we're also recognize that a lot of clinicians still need training. And it's important to note that we are continuing to create education around this and to help guide clinicians and radiologists on identifying and managing this particular risk. So what would be the outcome of treatment? What would someone expect from taking an anti-amyloid treatment today? These are the first, we hope, of many treatments that will really go after the underlying biology. And these treatments are really designed to slow down the disease process. So what does that mean to potentially you or a loved one? That means the hope is that they can keep doing what they want to for a longer period of time, particularly in a time of their life when the disease is at an earlier stage, when there's a higher quality of life as well. These treatments have been tested, not the particular two that I'm talking about right now, but many other anti-amyloid approaches have been tested at later stages of disease, in moderate to severe stages of Alzheimer's disease, and they've not shown to be very effective. So right now, we know that we have to get these treatments to individuals at earlier stages of disease. But we also recognize the response to the treatment may be different for each individual who takes these treatments. But there's been a lot of discussion about what is clinically meaningful to people. And the Alzheimer's Association has convened a work group of experts to really discuss what that means when we're talking about clinical trial data, to discuss the different considerations of how we interpret both the cognitive and functional measurements into something that people and patients and doctors can understand based on that clinical trial information. We need to be able to identify what is considered as meaningful in terms of its benefit or a meaningful slowing of fatal diseases like Alzheimer's disease. So there's no confusion for not only the researchers that are doing this work, but also for clinicians and patients that might be wanting to try these treatments. And the Alzheimer's Association worked with this work group and just published a paper really focused on clinical meaningfulness. And what we've looked at is modeling out what is clinically meaningful to people based on the data that exists in these trials. We're really talking about a slowing of progression of Alzheimer's disease that has measurable benefits. When you look at this graphic based on the data that exists from the trials, this is a test that's used in the clinical study called a CDR sum of boxes. And it's looking at a difference between someone who's taking the treatment and someone who's on a placebo. Based on this treatment over time, we're not just looking at the individual time points, but over time, there's an estimated 25% slowing of progression at every visit. Not just 25% total, but 25% slowing of progression at every visit. And we think, we don't know this yet, but we have to study these drugs and treatments for a longer period of time. But we expect that that disease, that slowing of progression may actually accumulate over time. And you may actually see a spreading or a widening of this slowing over time, which would be really exciting for patients and their families. And it really illustrates, I think, the time saving that you're seeing between the change in score that someone is getting at each different time point in these clinical trials and the slowing and delay of disease as compared to someone who's not taking treatment. But I think I noted earlier in my talk, we're not just talking about going after amyloid beta. You can see that on this graphic here. Today, there's over 140 unique therapies that are being tested in clinical trials today that target multiple aspects of Alzheimer's or other dementia biology. There's certainly drugs that are in development and treatments that are looking at tau, neurotransmitters, how the cells are communicating with each other, the bioenergetics of cells, how they actually use energy, and vascular stress or neuroinflammation. So many different types of approaches are being tested. And we think it's really important to note this because it's highly likely that treatments in the future will be combination approaches like they are with cancer and cardiovascular disease treatments today. You will be getting a combination of very powerful, effective treatments, but you'll also be incorporating risk reduction strategies as part of that approach, lifestyle interventions that may actually help to stall or even slow down disease progression over time. And based on this last graphic, I did want to note we're expecting an update to these numbers soon, but there's a report put out every year by Dr. Jeffrey Cummings and his team published in our journal, Alzheimer's and Dementia. And from 2022, they noted that there was 143 unique therapies being tested in over 172 clinical trials today. And you can see based on this graphic that there's a lot of different types of therapies in that pipeline. Most of them are really focused on what we would call disease modification, or ways to slow down that disease progression. But there's also treatments that are focused on the behavioral and neuropsychiatric symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And there's treatments that are focused on cognitive enhancement. I think important to note is that these are just the treatments that are being tested for Alzheimer's disease. These don't even count treatments that are being tested for frontotemporal degeneration, Lewy body dementias, vascular dementia. There's so many more studies that are happening. But look at this number here. The number of participants required for these currently recruiting trials is over 50,000 people to complete these studies. That really tells me that we all need to get involved. It's important for us to be a part of that progress. If we want new treatments and we want to get to a cure, we all have to participate in that research too. I even have a profile on our trial match portal, which is a free clinical trials matching service, which really helps people to find and sort out over 700 different clinical studies that might be a right fit for you. You could be a part of a new treatment trial. You could participate in developing a new blood test, or maybe be part of an exercise study. So if you're looking for more information about how to participate in clinical trials, I really encourage you to reach out to the Alzheimer's Association, and we can connect you to some of those resources where you can search for a study that might be a right fit for you. So last but not least, I want to touch on a few last topics around, well, where do we go from here? It's such an exciting time that we are seeing so many new biomarkers in development, so many new treatments in development, and new treatments being approved every day. But we know that a lot of our work still has to be done outside of the clinical trial setting. There's a lot of work. We can need to continue to follow people for a longer period of time and watch how these treatments sort of evolve in the broader population. And the Alzheimer's Association has really noticed that this is going to be an important new future for us in terms of being able to participate and help the field to follow individuals on new treatments and diagnostics. So we launched at our Alzheimer's Association International Conference last year, the Alzheimer's Network, and that stands for the Alzheimer's Network for Treatment and Diagnostics. Now, we call this ALZNet for short, and ALZNet was launched with fantastic leadership, Dr. Maria Carrillo, who's the Chief Science Officer of the Alzheimer's Association, Dr. Gil Rabinovich, who is he is a professor and neurologist at the University of California, San Francisco, and Dr. Michael Raffi, who is a professor and neurologist at the University of Southern California. And we have many partners that are a part of ALZNet that are helping us to collect data. What does that really mean? Well, ALZNet is really meant to collect real-world data and evidence for tracking FDA-approved drugs in the general population. It's meant to be what we call a treatment agnostic network to follow patient treatment and care in real-world clinical settings. And treatment agnostic means that we're going to be following these two new therapies that were just approved, but any new treatment that's approved from 2021 on is going to be incorporated into ALZNet. So treatments that are approved to treat even the behavioral and neuropsychiatric features of Alzheimer's, or other sort of drugs that go after slowing down that disease progression. And it's really designed to work in conjunction with a lot of other studies that are conducted by academics or industry or federal agencies, and even our ALZNet project team. And so what is ALZNet meant to do? Talking about this network, what does it actually do? So ALZNet really is meant to be a volunteer, physician enrolled, or a provider enrolled network. So that means you can't sign yourself up to this, but your doctor could help to sign you up for this if they are participating ALZNet site. Now, this multi-site network will help with enrollment as well as data collection. And it's really meant to help also train and educate clinicians and provide them resources in providing better care and improving care for anyone that's living with Alzheimer's disease. It's going to collect patient data over time. At the start of treatment, and then for however long a patient continues to want to participate in ALZnet. There's no end date. It's going to collect measures of cognition, someone's function and safety. It's going to archive brain imaging as well as safety and genetic and other biomarker data. And then it's really going to allow us to track health outcomes and resource utilization of people who are participating. And we are an open science organization. So one thing that's really important about ALZnet is that it will continue to share de-identified data, brain scans, and potentially even blood samples for research purposes with the research and clinical community. And one thing to note is that ALZnet is actually, I don't know how many of you read prescribing information very carefully, but ALZnet is actually now part of the new, what they call prescribing information or labels for Aduhelm and Leqembi. And we see that this is hopefully a pattern for any new Alzheimer's treatments for the future, that providers and patients are being encouraged to actually participate in ALZnet so that we can continue to follow these new treatments in real world settings. So really exciting to see this. So what are a couple examples that ALZnet could answer? ALZnet really is meant to continue to gather that evidence over time. Outside of that narrowly defined clinical trials, outside of the 1.5 years of studies that are usually conducted, we could follow participants for decades. We could answer questions such as this. We could watch their change across their treatment duration. We could look at identifying who's responding and not responding to treatments and even predicting response. We could look at data on outcomes on treatments across what we call MOA, mechanisms of action, like the anti-amyloid treatments, or across different classes of therapeutics. And what I think we really hope to learn through ALZnet is that it's going to create a more equitable access to treatments and will offer an opportunity to improve care more equitably. The goal is to be able to enroll a number of different types of clinical practices, but we recognize that all of those providers and practices may have different resources. So our hope as an association is that we will continue to provide all resources around guidelines and education, not only for diagnosis, but also treatment. And then resources for ALZnet providers, those that become a part of the site. We could do specialized training for those clinicians, for their staff. And then the goal in the future really is that we're moving towards a place of site accreditation and certification for providers so that they become sites of excellence for treating patients. We already have a number of sites that have been up and running. We have 8 sites now that are in the startup phase, and I can tell you that we just invited 15 more sites, so we're continuing to spread across the country. We have already, I think, nearly 20 patients enrolled. I believe the majority of them are taking aducanumab or Aduhelm, so we're following their treatment in the pipeline today. But we already have, I think, over 90 other sites that are in the queue to actually become ALZnet sites. And I think one thing that's really exciting is that we're not only doing this within the United States of America, we are also talking to different researchers and clinicians around the globe. So we've been having discussions with researchers in Australia, in Iceland, and in the UK, and in South Korea. So our goal is that we will create, hopefully, a large network on a global level in terms of how we can continue to collect information and data from patients that are taking these novel and new FDA-approved or other regulatory agency-approved treatments. So what I hope I was able to give you a perspective of today is that we really are in a new phase of research, treatment, and care. And this is the ecosystem that we are living in. And it's just such an exciting time that we are now really moving, I think, more steadily into treatment and monitoring, because we have new treatments that are hopefully going to be available more broadly for our patients and families as we progress into the next few months and years. So it's a really exciting time. I want to make sure that I thank you all for listening, and thank you for being a part of all of our efforts efforts through the Alzheimer's Association. We have an incredible mission, and much of it is backed and based in research, and we couldn't do it without you. And so thank you for listening. And I hope, Nick, that maybe we have some time for questions that may have popped up during my talk. I'm going to stop sharing my slides so I can see all of you now.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Edelmayer. My gosh, so much great information. And we do have several questions if you're ready to rock and roll with those.
Absolutely.
All right. Our first one, we have a question. So you said what's good for the heart is good for your brain. And we know from the work of Dr. Dean Ornish that we can reverse heart disease through various lifestyles, medicines. What research is being done to determine what is most helpful nutritionally in slowing progression and reversing Alzheimer's disease?
Oh, fantastic question. I didn't even touch on a lot of the risk work that's ongoing today. But there is a lot of work trying to understand the nutritional sort of requirements or something that could even help reduce our risk for developing Alzheimer's and other dementia. There have been some studies that have really focused on specific diets. I would say a lot of research, I think the strongest studies that we've seen that are focused on not only nutrition, but capturing changes in cognition and function, have really looked at diets that are, I think there's 3 that we've seen that have the most data. One is the Mediterranean diet. One is a diet called the DASH diet, which is sort of important for hypertension. And one is called the MIND diet. And the MIND diet is a bit of a mix between the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. And those diets have shown us that you may be able to reduce your risk for developing cognitive decline, but also potentially even slow down changes in sort of disease progression over time. Now, there still need to be repeated. I think some of those trials, they also need to be done in more diverse populations because the Mediterranean diet and the MIND diet are not necessarily diets that everyone eats. So I think one thing that we're really trying to understand too is what's going to be the most culturally appropriate nutritional approach too for families across the globe. And we continue to see a lot of that work done in looking at I would say more multi-factor risk reduction. So nutrition is being incorporated into studies that are not only testing nutrition, but also physical activity and social and cognitive engagement. And one of the first studies to look at those sort of 3 factors together was one that was done in Finland, and it was called the FINGER trial. And the FINGER trial showed that if you combine many of these factors together, including nutrition, that you are able to reduce your risk for developing cognitive decline in people who do not yet have any symptoms, but have a family history. Well, we're actually trying to reproduce that Finnish study here in the United States. And we're running something called the US Pointer study. And it's looking at a very similar factors, nutrition, cardiovascular sort of health factors, as well as physical activity and social and cognitive engagement. So our hope is that we will learn more from the US Pointer study on what the best recipe around nutrition and other factors might be. But today, I would say that from what we know, eating a diet that's healthy in sort of whole foods is really the best place to get your nutrition, not just downing a bunch of different supplements, but really trying to get your eat a heart healthy diet if you can, that is high, in leafy vegetables, low in sort of saturated unhealthy animal fats, high in maybe fish and legumes and things of this nature to really help support your brain health.
Great, thank you. And fresh fish in Hawaii is very easy to come by, so everybody go
Very
have a
lucky.
salad today. All right, I have a next question here. How long will it take for those approved drugs to become affordable?
So this is a struggle we're having right now. So these approved drugs are right now not covered by Medicare in our country. And we know that Medicare tends to drive the tone for other types of insurance providers as well. So right now there's very limited access to some of these new treatments, but I encourage people who are looking for access to these treatments they can potentially right now participate in clinical trials. They also can reach out to the companies who are manufacturing these treatments, because I know there are some patient assistance programs and they can help walk you through some options and answer questions about how to potentially gain access. But obviously, talking to your doctor first is going to be one of those important steps to see if you even are eligible for these treatments. But I think we as an organization continue to call on the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid to really change their decision around the access to these treatments, because we recognize that right now there's not equitable access. So it's something that we're working on very hard as an organization. I encourage you to connect back with the chapter if you'd like to learn more on ways that you can help to advocate for many of the things that we do as an association.
Awesome, thank you. All right, here's the next one. It's talking about the research of Richard Johnson that outlines in a recent paper, could Alzheimer's disease be a maladaptation of the evolutionary survival pathway mediated by intracerebral fructose and uric acid metabolism, cited for 2023, the polyol pathway that converts glucose to fructose via sorbitol in the brain. Huang et al. Demonstrated that the activation of polyol pathway in the human brain with concomitant production of fructose from glucose. So where do you stand on the work of Dale Bredesen? That's a long one there.
Dale Bredesen. Yeah, okay. So there is a lot of work that's being done to try to continue to understand all of the different contributors. I hope you kind of remember that wheel that I put up of the different potential complex pathways that might be driving Alzheimer's disease. When we talk about some of the metabolomics of the cells themselves, how they use energy. And I think that's kind of what, I haven't read that particular paper, but I think that that's kind of what we're trying to understand over time. We know as we age, our cells become less efficient, also not only in like creating energy for our cells to use it, but also utilizing the energy. And when you talk about all these different conversions of sugars and how they may relate to our cell energy processes, that is under investigation today. I think in terms of like, it's not as simple as what we eat develops into the energy that our cells create. That's not necessarily how our cells work, but our cells can be most efficient at creating energy when we're also eating and getting healthy nutrition. So I just want to try to make sure that that's understood. But there are a number of diets that are out there that have been created, or protocols that have been created. But I'd like to stress again, I think some of the work that has been presented by Dr. Bredesen at this time, there's not randomized controlled clinical trials of a large scale that have been conducted to say that that particular diet is going to be effective at treating Alzheimer's disease or even preventing Alzheimer's disease. A lot of that work has been done on an individual basis. So each individual may have a slightly different protocol. So for us as an organization, it's hard for us to say that the learnings from that protocol are generalizable to everybody. And that's why we are running something called the US Pointer Study to really help us understand how a single trial can really predict whether or not diet can be supportive or not of our brains. But there is a lot of work, and we're funding some of this work too, Nick. I want to be sure that people understand that. We're funding a lot of work through our Part the Cloud clinical trial program, and some of it is focused on sort of cellular metabolism or inflammation. And a lot of these can be driven by multiple processes in the brain. So not only are we trying to understand the biology behind them, but could we use that understanding to develop treatments in the future?
Great. Dr. Edelmayer, what are your thoughts on genetic testing in order to tell somebody the likelihood that they may be developing Alzheimer's disease later in life? For example, if this person's mother has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
So let me just double check. So you're saying that the family history of Alzheimer's, and you're wondering if you should get genetic testing as well. Is that the question?
And what about, and I guess they're asking about, how, telling somebody about their likelihood based on those testing, that testing.
Yeah. So I would say that we are still learning more about genetic testing. Most of, how much I would say genetics drive Alzheimer's disease. There is one gene that has been, I would say it's the most commonly studied gene and the one we know the most about today in terms of genetic risk. It does not necessarily mean that it will predetermine you to get Alzheimer's disease, but we're studying risk, and it's a gene called ApoE4. ApoE actually comes in 3 flavors: ApoE2, ApoE3, and ApoE4. And when you have more than one copy of ApoE4, it increases your risk for developing Alzheimer's disease if you're an individual of European descent. And I say this with a big caveat because most of the research has only been conducted in individuals of Northern European descent, looking at that ApoE gene. So when we look at ApoE in other individuals of different races and ethnicities, we don't see that it drives risk in the same patterns as it does in individuals who are white. And so we are still seeing a lot more research come out about what different genes may drive risk in individuals of other races and ethnicities in different populations. So I think we know some about how risk is driven by genetics, but we need to learn more too about how risk plays a role based on ancestry, and how to make sure that that information is also conveyed to everyone. So learning about your risk does not mean you are predetermined to develop Alzheimer's disease. And it really does, we don't have the personal information of who asked this question, but it really does depend also on your race, ethnicity, and a lot of other health conditions and other factors that might be driving your disease process.
And that's perfect. It leads right into this next question. Is it safe to say or to think that Alzheimer's can be caused directly or indirectly by environment changes?
That's another great question. When we think about some of the modifiable factors, we know that environmental and lifestyle changes, environmental or lifestyle factors are likely contributing to our risk. How they drive an individual is something we still need to understand, because most of that data, especially around environmental and lifestyle factors, is gained from what we would call our observational studies, or even epidemiological studies. We can't test ethically putting someone in a poor environment and seeing who turns out better in the end 10 years later. That's not something we can test. What we can do right now is we can look at a lot of different population level data. So for example, I can tell you, I think at our international conference, AAIC, I think 2 years ago, there was a collection of research we saw focused on environmental factors that might lead to increased risk. And they were looking at the level of fine particulate matter in the atmosphere that might be in someone's environment where they live. And there was a study conducted in California, I think one conducted in Latin America, and one that was conducted in France. So we were noticing across these communities that people that lived in a more urban environment or exposed to particular community sort of environment, they were at a higher risk for developing dementia based on the observations of the medical history of people and patterns that we saw in those environments. So again, it gets back to, we need to truly understand what may be driving that risk in those individuals, because it's not just the environment and the particulate that they might be exposed to. Their people's access to education, quality health care, safe environments to even go out and exercise in. Many of these things may also be sort of intertwined. And so we need to continue to understand that, but understanding also how we may share environmental and lifestyle factors with our own families. And when we talk about family history of disease, that's not just including our genetic shared factors. It includes things like, what are we eating across our life course? What does our education look like? What does our access to quality healthcare and our environment look like? So it may play a role, but it might be different for each individual. So we need to learn more, but the more we learn, the more it will help us guide even public health strategies, changes in our legislation and infrastructure to support families, if it's going to be something structural like this that we know is going to be helpful for our brains.
Great. Okay, we have time for one more question. So I want to ask, is there a time frame when MCI or mild cognitive impairment leads to Alzheimer's or other dementia?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult question for me to answer, because I think that I think the number is something like, we believe close to 15% of people who develop mild cognitive impairment will go on to develop Alzheimer's disease or Alzheimer's dementia, excuse me. But how quickly people transition is very, very difficult for us to be able to gather from the available data. I can tell you as an organization, we've done the most calculations that we can. And one of the things that we have learned is that we've been looking at who may be transitioning out of mild cognitive impairment into mild dementia, and then maybe transitioning into stages of moderate dementia, where they would no longer then be eligible for these new treatments. And our estimate is something like, we think potentially close to 2,000 people a day, maybe transitioning from mild dementia into moderate, meaning they would no longer be eligible for some of these new treatments. But it's very hard to say that with complete accuracy based on the data that we have. A lot of people aren't even getting a diagnosis. So that's part of the problem, is they may be living with mild cognitive impairment for multiple years before they even get that diagnosis. So we will learn more, again, from research. And as we move and shift that paradigm to prevention strategies and testing clinical trials, in people that don't have MCI yet. So great question. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think everybody transitions at a different state, a different pace. So it makes that even harder to answer.
Great. Well, thank you so much for answering those questions. And, we're out of time, but I want to turn it back over to our Executive Director, LJ, to close us out today. LJ, floor is yours.
Thank you, Nick. And real quickly, everyone, I'm sorry, could you see my screen, Nick? Great. Thank you, Dr. Edelmayer, for joining us today, and Nick for helping facilitate our program today. Just real quickly, we have some upcoming events we wanted to share with everyone. If you need information about our support groups and other education programs, please visit our website at alz.org/Hawaii. There's a Caring for the Caregiver seminar on Saturday, February 25th at Kaimuki Christian Church. We have Hawaii State Advocacy Day that's focusing on Alzheimer's disease awareness on Thursday, March 2nd at the Hawaii State Capitol. And then our Ola Nalima Malama Hawaii Caregiver Conference featuring Tipa Snow is scheduled for Tuesday, April 4 at Alohilani Resort, Waikiki. This will also be offered virtually. So if you have any questions or you want more information about any of these events, please reach out to us at alohainfo@alz.org. Also, we invite you and others in your network to join us as a volunteer. There is so much work that needs to be done, and we can't do it alone. There is volunteer opportunities for anyone interested in joining our Kokua crew. And if you are not already, we ask that you please consider becoming a donor for the Alzheimer's Association. By making a financial contribution, you're certainly going to help us move our mission forward. Information about how to become a volunteer or how to make a donation to the association will be shared by email along with a recording of today's program. And lastly, we at the Alzheimer's Association, you as a volunteer or a donor are part of history in the making. There has never been an Alzheimer's treatment ever, and today we have two. And this new era of treatment will pave the way for so many other discoveries, like we have seen with other disease states like HIV/AIDS, cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. So it's an exciting time. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you have a great day. Mahalo.